Hi, this is Bob Sorrentino from GarageBandits.online, and I'm here today with two of the foremost Beatles experts in the United States, Lou Longobardi and Bruce Spizer. And Bruce is the author of several, or I should say more than several, books on the Beatles recording. So, welcome, Lou,
Nice to be here.
and welcome, Bruce.
Likewise, fun to be here.
And speaking of fun, we're here today. We're going to have a little fun with the Paul is dead conspiracy theories that have been floating around for, I guess, almost 50 years now, or probably 50 years for sure. So, with that, Bruce, I know from speaking to you before that what most of us believe is that this all got started with a college newspaper. So, is that true? And could you expand a little bit on that?
Well, it's true for the U.S. rumor, but there was a pre-rumor that actually happened in January of '66, where on a rainy night, a vehicle that was owned by Paul was involved in a motor accident on the M1, and people jumped to the conclusion that Paul had been in a serious automobile accident, perhaps even killed. And that rumor was quickly dispelled because we were able to call Paul up at his place in St. John's Wood, and he said, "Hey, I'm fine," and that was the end of it. But that didn't happen in September, in October, and November of 1969. And what happened was the editor of the Drake University Times Delphic was at a party, and while he was there, having, I guess, a few drinks or whatever, started talking to this woman, and she told him about the fact that Paul was dead, and there were clues to it in the Beatles albums and the covers and in the music. He thought that was kind of interesting and talked to one of his staff writers, a guy named Tim Harper. And so Tim sat down and wrote an article that was called essentially, Is Paul McCartney dead? And in it, it went through some of the supposed clues as to whether Paul was dead or alive. And that might have been the end of it, except for the fact that you were dealing with a college university newspaper. Now, bear in mind, we had no internet back then, but you had kids who knew each other at other universities, so they call up their friends. And there was somebody at Northern Illinois University that got wind of it, and she wrote a story in their paper, basically plagiarized the other story. And so you had those two stories out there, but that wouldn't have been enough to really get it going. And where it really gets momentum is a few weeks later, there's a disc jockey in Detroit, Russ Gibb. And on his show, he's just doing, his Uncle Russ afternoon show on a Sunday. And some caller calls in and says, "Well, what do you think about this Paul is dead thing?" What are you talking about? Well, you know that if you play this particular track, you hear this. So all of a sudden, the disc jockey tells someone, get a White Album. And they put on Revolution 9 and they do the number 9 and they do it backwards. And it sounds like, "Turn me on, Debman, turn me on, Debman." And then, wow, and then the person starts telling them other things. And so now you have a major radio station in Detroit broadcasting this. And one of the people listening to it is a guy named Fred Labor, who is at the University of Michigan. And Fred hears part of the show, and Fred has been assigned the job of reviewing the album Abbey Road. So Fred gets this crazy idea. Rather than writing a review of Abbey Road, he'll write something about Paul being dead and bring in the clues that he heard on the radio, but also he gets out his Beatle albums and starts looking for things that he can make up as clues. And he finishes the article in about 90 minutes. He tells his editor, "This is the best BS I've ever written in my life." I mean, they know it's not true. It has enough things in there to make you think it might be true, but a lot of things that were totally made up. And it's done tongue in cheek. Yet, that campus newspaper just, they have to do another printing of it. And the next thing you know, all of a sudden, people are calling up. There are people that they went to college with and high school buddies. And it spreads not just to, colleges, but high schools now, because if you're a freshman at the University of Michigan, you've got friends that are seniors in your high school. And so all of this starts happening, and other radio stations start jumping on it, and even the mainstream press. And all of a sudden, the next thing you know, you have all these things about Paul being dead. So that's kind of how it got started. And I guess, Lou and I can talk about some of the clues and what they mean and things like that. But it really was, an editor of a college newspaper at a party talking to a girl. I don't know if they've ever figured out who the girl was, and I'm sure she didn't invent it on her own. It was probably she and some friends sitting around doing a joint or two and seeing stuff and coming up with this.
That is, it's interesting that yeah, we never know who this where it actually originated, and what really prompted someone to notice whatever those things were that they initially noticed. I mean, I remember, back in that time, I was just starting my freshman year in college, and I was more into, at that point, my baseball team, the New York Mets, the Miracle Mets, were, on their way to their first World Series that October. So, I don't remember exactly when I heard about it. I don't remember the moment when I heard about, or even how, whether it was radio or from someone else, how I heard about it. But I remember when I did, I turned to my best Beatle buddy, who was my cousin Jim, and he said, you know, hey, you remember when we opened up Sergeant Pepper and we looked at the centerfold of the gatefold of Sergeant Pepper and we said, "Is that Paul? Is that really? That doesn't look like Paul." I said, "Yeah, I do remember saying that." And he said, "And remember we were talking about how his vocals sounded, so great on the White Album. It's like every song he sang, he was hitting everything note for note, but." It sounded like he used to have some trouble, like in For No One, hitting the high notes, and his voice was a little bit seemed deeper, a little bit more nasal. And we had commented on that. We said, "Boy, his vocals really have gotten better." This was a year before, so we said, "What is this all about? Let's get into it." So we did. So we started looking into all of the clues, and we went, right through with the TV special and all of that. So.
Yeah, I kind of remember hearing something on the radio. And so I got out my album covers, of course, and yeah, I started looking at Magical Mystery Tour, and I was told that the word walrus in the Greek language meant corpse. And that sounded perfectly reasonable to me because I couldn't Google it to see if that were true. So, sure, that was true. And then, if you looked at Sergeant Pepper, Paul had that patch on his arm, and that sure did look like OPD, and that would stand for officially pronounced dead. I got that, yeah. And Paul had his back to the camera. That was a little strange. And George's thumb was departing on the lyrics on the back cover to Wednesday morning at 3 a.m. So is that when this car crash happened? Yeah, that kind of makes sense. And then, Magical Mystery Tour, Paul in a lot of photos and also on the Sergeant Pepper cover, he has a hand above his head. And I was told, that was a sign that somebody was dead if they had a hand above their head. That sounded good to me. The Abbey Road cover, the license plate said, 28 if Paul would have been 28 if he were alive. Of course, he would have been 27, but don't worry about that. Never let the truth get in the way of a good rumor. And the album cover, I mean, just look at them. George is dressed as a gravedigger. And Ringo's in black, that would be the mortician. John's in white. I mean, John's this godlike figure, and Paul's obviously a corpse because people are buried without their shoes on. I mean, I wasn't a grave digger. I didn't know people wore shoes when they were buried if they wanted to, or if the family wanted them to do. I guess they didn't make that decision. So, and then I started, okay, well, what about the, playing Revolution 9 backwards? And I got my record player and I set it up to a cassette player and I played the entire song backwards. It's really freaky backwards, not just the Turn Me On Dead Man thing. And so all this stuff was there. And so, I had a very busy night and I go to school the next day and I was like the known Beatles expert in my class. And these girls came up to me, is Paul really dead? And I said, no, 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 Paul's not dead. I said, but maybe the Beatles are playing a joke on us because there were just so many clues. And later that year, I wrote a paper on it. I got an A on it for one of my classes. And in the paper, I said that, that the Beatles had planted these clues. Now, why did I believe that? Well, because, it made sense in the sense that if you believed the lies or the made up clues, there were enough real things that you would see and that might be true. And that's what made it so fascinating. And the great thing about what Fred Laborde did, he took certain things and then made up stuff. By the way, walrus is not Greek for corpse. That's completely made up. Just as an octopus's garden is not where war heroes are buried, and things like that. So there's just a lot of things that were in this that weren't true. And by the way, if you look at the cover of Abbey Road, they are not walking out of a cemetery. They're walking across the street away from Abbey Road Studios. So, a lot of the things that we accepted as true back in 1969, we later realized they weren't true. So, we'll keep that in mind when we build this to a climax and I tell people what I really think about all this. But as a kid, I was convinced that Paul had to be alive simply because nobody could be that talented in 1960, 4, 65, 66, and then another person come in and be equally talented, if not more so. To me, it had to be the same person. I wasn't buying that conspiracy theory. I felt that Paul was alive and well, and that the Beatles were pulling a fast one on us, was what I thought at the time.
You certainly weren't alone, and while, as you say, there's things that they just are completely in error. I mean, they just don't make sense. Things that we heard, yeah, they're made up. Some of them are actually made up, and then there are other things that are there. Who knows what they mean? Who knows, what kind of coincidence took place, to make them happen. But it certainly took on a life of its own. That's for sure.
Oh, absolutely. Pre-internet.
Yeah, yeah. Even to the point where, as I say, I remember watching and taping, and I think I still have a cassette tape of the trial, the mock trial that was headed up by, of all people, F. Lee Bailey. And he interviewed, I believe he brought Russ Gibb onto it, and he may have even brought Fred LeBour on it, onto the show. Peter Asher appeared on the show and testified. And so there was they played the tapes and tried to make explanations. Sometimes I think the explanations they gave made things worse, to be actually honest with you. Some of the explanations, they weren't consistent with each other, even within the Beatles camp. Some of them were more easily refutable than probably the truth. But so I'm not sure where they were getting all of their answers from. But F. Lee Bailey kind of left it, just left it alone, and let's say, all right, you're the jury, you decide. And I guess that's where we are, almost 51 years later. We're still reading the books, or at least I'm still reading the books. I've read them all, and I've seen it from all the different angles. And preposterous, you can't argue that it's anything but preposterous. But kernels of truth, kernels of doubt.
But that's the thing that you do when you're doing a piece on a rumor where you're trying to make people believe it. You have to have some true things in there that are things people thought about but didn't know the answer to. So, for example, in it, one of the things he says is that the Beatles were working on this album called Smile, and that they didn't finish the album, after Paul died, and they gave the tapes to Brian Wilson. And then Brian came out with an album, Smiley Smile, with the Beach Boys. And you think, yeah, I remember Smile never came out. It wasn't the Beach Boys, it was the Oh, that makes sense. Yeah, I get it. And that was the type of thing it was doing. And if you wondered, what was that patch on Paul's arm? Well, now I know it's officially pronounced dead. No, it's not. It's Ontario Police Precinct. It's OPP, but that's beside the point. And things like that. And then, it just was like that. There's just so many things that were fun. And you said, okay. And so, of course, I found more clues because I went back further than Sergeant Pepper. I took Revolver. And, if you take the Revolver cover and you turn it sideways, Paul looks like he is facing upward. And he's the only Beatle doing so. So it's like he's lying on a concrete slab at a morgue or something. And then Yesterday and Today, if you take that album cover and you turn it sideways, Paul is sitting in a steamer trunk and Ringo has his hand on the lid. What if Ringo, the mortician, is closing the coffin that Paul is in? And then if you look at the back of the album cover, I'm only sleeping. John isn't dead. He's only sleeping. Nowhere Man. John's a nowhere man. Because he's singing about Paul being dead. Paul is the nowhere man, not John. And these things, drive my car. Yeah, Paul died in a car wreck. It's so obvious what goes on. Well, what goes on? Paul's dead. Everything that you look at, we can work it out. Paul's dead. What are we going to do? We can work it out. We'll have someone else join the group. And so that's how it starts going. And where did this Billy Campbell thing come in? Fred LeBour needed a lookalike person. He was thinking Glenn Campbell, because Glenn Campbell had sat in with the Beach Boys, and he just changed to Billy Campbell. So I mean, and things like that just happen, and you start putting it together. But the great thing about it was, like any good rumor, there were enough things in there to where, you could believe it. But I think the dead giveaway in Fred LeBour's article was he talked about this being this, because he gets into Abbey Road and talks about it actually being this religion thing that John is bringing us. And at the end of it, he ends his piece by saying that Paul is the Son of God, with Son spelled S-U-N, because of, here comes the Son and Sun King. And it's clearly tongue in cheek.
So I have a question for either one of you guys. Did anyone ever ask any of the Beatles, specifically Paul, I guess, about the rumors, and was there any truth to it?
I mean, Paul was asked about it early on, and he gave a flippant answer that didn't help things. He said, if I was dead, I'd be the last person to know. And so that didn't really help matters. But I think over the years, they've just kind of, you know, just, this is just absurd. No, Paul isn't dead, And of course, it was, Capitol Records loved it, because what happened with Capitol Records is Abbey Road comes out on the Apple label, but it's still a Capitol album. And so all of a sudden, Abbey Road, which was selling well to begin with, is really selling well. And to really understand the full story, you need Magical Mystery Tour to look at those pictures, and you need to play Strawberry Fields, because at the end of Strawberry Fields, John clearly says, I buried Paul. Now, I listened to it. I thought John said, I'm very bored. Years later, I learned he was saying cranberry sauce. He certainly wasn't saying I buried Paul, but in my mind, he was. Yeah, Blackbird. You're just some mumbling on it. But if you're told going in, the mumbling is Paul is a dead man, miss him. You hear Paul is a dead man, miss him. A lot of these clues could be dismissed, but not playing number 9 on Revolution 9 backwards. It clearly sounds like turn me on, Debin, turn me on, Debin. Now think about that. How hard would it be if you were in the studio to do turn me on, Debin, and get it to come back and say number 9? You couldn't do it. It was just one of these incredible coincidences. And so that was always my view of it, was that, but I just thought it was, like I said, planned, because there were so many of them. And Paul wearing a black flower on Magical Mystery Tour, why would a florist even send a black flower? And that's why I really thought at the time it was probably, but Paul's explanation later was it happened to be a black one in the box, and I just happened to put it on, and that's probably true.
That was his explanation, but it's funny because I just watched Magical Mystery Tour about a week ago, and I happened to watch the ending where they're dressed and they're doing the "Your Mother Should Know," and as they're approaching, as they come down the steps and then they start walking, Paul is holding a very full bouquet of flowers. It's a different bouquet than you see in the photograph. It seems the continuity must have gone off, and the one that was handed to him is different from the one he ends up with at the very end and where the photo was taken. But as he's walking forward, it's a very full bouquet, and there's a lot of red flowers there. So if he wanted to have a red flower, he could have had a red flower.
But think about it. Paul was just, well, that's cool. I'll put on a black one.
Exactly. I mean, a lot of this, I mean, he obviously was, let's use the metaphorically or out of step, not to use the Abbey Road, to have a pun on Abbey Road, but he was out of step in a lot of these clues. The back to the camera, on the back of Sergeant Pepper's, um, the hand over the head, in a couple of places, including in Yellow Submarine, where it was a drawing. So that wasn't something that's not something that just happened, and it just could have been a coincidence. Who knows what it meant? But yeah, was Paul one to try and be different? Yeah, he probably was. And if he just said, "Yeah, give me the black flower," or "I'm going to turn around," or maybe they took the picture was posed.
Yeah, they took multiple pictures. They just
Yeah, there were multiple pictures. I mean, he happened to have the black instrument, on the front cover, and he happened to have his back turned on the back cover, and not only that, but even where George is pointing to Wednesday morning at 5 o'clock, in order for that to happen, they had to reverse the negative of that picture. If you look at that picture closely, you'll see that it's a reverse negative. So had they not used the reverse negative, forget about whether he was facing frontward or backward, but if they didn't print the photo in a reverse, George's thumb would not be pointing to that spot. So, you said, well, is that, so all these things that, yeah, I mean, the walrus stuff, and it means this, and the pennies in the eyes, and it means this in Scandinavia, and it means this in Italy, and all this other stuff. I mean, that's all crazy. But the things that are there, you have to say, and I think you do, whatever they mean, maybe nothing, but it's certainly fodder for conversation.
Oh, it is, and it's great. And I think, this is we're doing this sort of without editing right now. So I think when I was talking about it, I might have on the Pepper album got it mixed up with Sergeant Pepper, where Simon and Garfunkel and said, I was thinking 3 a.m. rather than 5 a.m. So if I did that, folks, I know it's 5 a.m., but don't worry about that. So we don't want to get Simon and Garfunkel into this rumor because it'll really, really go sideways.
Well, maybe that's the Paul that was dead. Maybe it was Paul Simon and it wasn't really Paul McCartney.
Could be. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, after all, Paul Simon got along with Art Garfunkel, and then he didn't.
And I think going back to the pictures, some of it could be just as simple as an artist photographer saying, "Hey, Paul, why don't you turn around? Let's just take a photo that way." Or, Paul just saying, I'm going to take my shoes off. But to you, I think the point to all of this is, if enough people tell you something, you can really start to believe it, and it feeds on itself, really.
Oh, absolutely. That's the beauty of a rumor, and it explains things that and some people theorize, well, why would somebody want to believe all this? Well, one of the things that was hard for us to accept back in 1969, even in the U.S., we were hearing some rumors of maybe the Beatles aren't going to stay together. And so, how do you explain, these four guys that know each other so well breaking up? Well, maybe, one of them's dead and there's a new guy in there. Yeah, that would explain it. And so, you start trying to get certain things explained, or like you said, gee, you listen to Lady Madonna, that's Paul singing, but it doesn't sound like Paul, sounds like Ringo. Well, maybe that's the new Paul, and so there's just so many things that you can move on it. And as I've said, what was great about the piece that Fred Laborde did was there was enough truth in there to make you think, okay, that really could be, and that's the whole idea when you're doing something like this. I did a piece, and my website is beetle.net, and there's one on the Paul is dead thing that I have on there. You'll take a look at it. It's a fun piece. And when I wrote the piece, the premise of the article that I wrote was that I had an interview with Paul McCartney in which Paul fessed up that the Beatles had planted all these clues and that they were behind it. And in it, I had, of course, my interview with Paul, my interview with Tony Barrow, who is a PR person, and I also interviewed one of the engineers at Abbey Road about how they were able. I think it was Alan Parsons I used, how they were able to to get "Turn Me On, Dead Man" in number 9 to work, and how long that took to get the tape to do that and stuff. And when I wrote it, of course, I put a lot of things in there that were very credible and sounded really true, but it was really done tongue in cheek. And it was crazy because there are still a lot of people that believe that piece is true. And I get email from people, God, that must have been cool interviewing Paul. How'd you get him to talk out like that? Nobody's ever talked out about that before. And so that was one of the really crazy things about it. I had a lot of fun doing that piece. And by the way, that piece ran in Goldmine magazine on their April 1st edition, and we'll just leave it at that.
Well, everybody, I've read that. Take a look at it and check out the date that it was written to. That's that's another important part. But yeah, as you say, you could make up and find the things that And Bob asked about. Did they ask Paul? Well, eventually they did. I mean, Life magazine sent some reporters out all the way up to Scotland to his house in Scotland, and they kind of trespassed onto Paul's property, which didn't make him too happy, and he reacted pretty angrily and chased them. But then he kind of thought better of it and said, "Okay, look, what do you want to do? Yeah, you got a story to do. I'll let you do the story." And they let him take photographs of him and the family, saying he was alive. Well, I mean that was fine, except the rumor said that there was an imposter, and that everybody knew that for the last 2 years, when he was supposedly dead, there was someone else who looked like him. So that didn't go a long way.
I don't know. I disagree with you on that in the sense that I think that started the rumor's demise. I think had Paul not done that, then I think the rumor would have persisted because, first of all, people were getting a statement. Apple says Paul said, and well, where's Paul? And so we weren't hearing or seeing Paul. And with the Life magazine story, it was okay. Well, yeah, that is Paul. So I think many people accepted it then. And I think at that point, that's when it lost momentum. Now, that's not saying that the rumor went away. It didn't. We're talking about it today. You can go on the internet now, and there are people that will show you look at this picture of Paul. You can see that this Paul is 2.5 inches taller than the real Paul when you compare his height to the height of the other Beatles. And, furthermore, look at the structure of Paul's face. His structure of his face is different. In why did the Beatles suddenly in 1967 grow mustaches? Because they wanted to cover up the real facial features, because if it was the real Paul, his face would look one way, but this fake Paul, the facial features were different. So what do? You hide it with the mustache. And so because Paul had a mustache, the others had to grow it, otherwise people would have been suspicious. Oh, that's why they grew mustaches. Now it makes sense to me. That's the beauty of a rumor like this, because it starts explaining things you always wondered about. If you didn't understand why the Beatles grew mustaches, now you know.
Well, when you think about it, I mean, how many people would have to be involved in this conspiracy?
Ah, and that's the whole point.
Only the right people.
But the whole point of it is, and the reason I'm not a big conspiracy buff is because word's going to get out, folks. In this case, supposedly, though, the way they wrote it was very clever. The only people who really knew about this, they forget the fact that doctors would have known about it and police would have known about it, but the only people in the world who knew about it was Ringo and George and John, George Martin and Brian Epstein. Nobody else knew. And what happened to Brian when Brian refused to go along? Brian was murdered, right? Of course. That explains Brian's death. In case we wondered what did Brian really die of, he was murdered because he knew too much. And by the way, do you really think that Paul would have written the song like When I'm 64 or Your Mother Should Know? Of course not. When I'm 64 was an old tune that George Martin had written. That's why it has that type of instrumentation in it. That's why Paul is holding an oboe. That's what George Martin used to play. It all is clear now. So that George Martin wrote those songs.
and and then the contra to that, they'll say, the last song that Paul wrote, why did they have to go back to When I'm 64, which he supposedly, admitted that he wrote when he was 14, and they played it back in the Cavern days. But the first song that they did when they went back in the studio in November of 1967, and they hadn't been in the studio since the spring of 66. I'm sorry, when they went back at the end of November of 66, when they started Sergeant Pepper, Strawberry Fields, Penny Lane stuff, was When I'm 64. Paul hadn't written any other song. He had to pull that one from years and years before, since The entire summer, that was the only song that they had.
So never mind the fact that Strawberry Fields was before When I'm 64, but let's not let the facts get in the way of a good rumor, right?
Yeah. Well, John wrote that one. That's because John. But Paul, when they got back in the studio, Paul, the new Paul, didn't have any songs to do.
So what they did, they just from the old cavern days, John remembered What I'm 64, and he taught it to the new Paul. I get it, because I thought George Martin wrote it. Silly me.
Did we ever think we were going to make it to 64 when we first heard that?
Oh my goodness. I thought I would make it to 64, but I did think it was really old. And last year I turned 64, and of course it's not old at all.
No, not at all.
No, and now I'm 65, and the only good thing about being 65 is your health insurance goes down because you go on Medicare. But anyway, I digress.
I remember calculating how old will I be in the year 2000. I remember how old will I be when I'm 64. I remember those years. So that's what was on our mind. But yeah, I mean, it was just, crazy stuff. I Am the Walrus, talking about I Am the Walrus with Magical Mystery Tour. They decided to put on King Lear and get the radio feed for the, and what did it happen to be? It happened to be the death scene of King Lear.
Is he dead now, Father? Rest you, rest you. Yeah, I mean, look, a lot of incredible coincidence. That was done live. That radio broadcast was put through the console by John live while he was mixing the song. You could not have planned that if you tried.
Right. And I mean, even the Magical Mystery Tour, which had a lot, had the I was, I was you sign, which was actually a sign from I was Lord Kitchener's valet. That was a boutique in London at the time, and I was Lord Kitchener's valet. And they used to sell, of all things, a lot of the old time military uniforms and jackets that became popular around that time. Paul did happen to have, he was in the military outfit at the time when they did, but I don't know where that costume came from. But, he happened to just have the logo from Lord Kitchener. I was Lord Kitchener's valet, and it happened to just say I was so prominently right in the front. So, like I say, the interpretational things of Scandinavian and all foreign meanings of things, that's one thing. But the things that are kind of right in your face, some of them do beg for an explanation.
Yeah, well, this has been a fascinating discussion, that's for sure. And Bruce, can you give us your website again and where people could find your books?
Yeah, my website is www.beatle.net, no S. And all the books are there. And what we're talking about are the Abbey Road book. I have a book called The Beatles Get Back to Abbey Road. And that book has two chapters, one that I wrote and one that Frank Daniels wrote on the Paul is Dead story. The one that I wrote, is kind of a lot of the things we've discussed here. The one that Frank wrote talks about conspiracy theories and the whole bit about it. And it's an interesting chapter because, make no mistake about it, the Paul is Dead thing is more than a rumor. It truly is a conspiracy theory and a very wonderful one at that. My latest book is called The Beatles Finally Let It Be. So although we still have to wait for that Peter Jackson film, I have my book out now. My book was, scheduled to come out September 4th of this year to coincide with the release of the Peter Jackson Get Back film. The film was delayed a year, and I thought, I've already done the book. I'm not going to wait a year. So I put it out. So for those of you that are missing the Peter Jackson film and all the other wonderful things Apple had in mind, you can wait a year, be frustrated and lonely, or you can go to my website, Beatle.net, and get the actual Let It Be book now. You don't have to wait a year to get the Beatles Finally Let It Be.
I can attest to that, and they were mailed out, and I just got my copy.
Thanks again, guys. I really appreciate the time.